Thank you, Dr. Dar, for that nice introduction. And greetings of the day to all the eminent panelists and participants. It is indeed an honor for me to participate in this National Summit on Cybersecurity. And I would like to thank Dr. Sunil Pandey and his team at ITS Ghaziabad for extending me this opportunity. I was chosen to speak on the subject of cyber governance in India, which is going to be somewhat different from probably what you normally hear on this topic. And so I hope you find it useful. And I shall begin by making some introductory remarks. Over the last decade or so, cyberspace has emerged as a new arena of conflict amongst nations, with cyber warfare growing in intensity with every passing year. To address this challenge, the more agile nations have brought about transformative changes in their cyber defense organizations. Most notably, the United States, China, UK, Russia, and Australia. The cyberspace governance models adopted by these countries vary in the role allocated to the armed forces vis-a-vis agencies responsible for internal security, law and order, and also the intelligence agencies. In India, the two main agencies tasked with the defense of our national cyberspace are the National Critical Information Infrastructure Protection Center, or the NCIIPC, which is a unit of the National Technical Research Organization, and the Indian Computer Emergency Response Team, called CERTIN, which functions under the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. It needs to be analyzed whether such an arrangement under the coordination of the National Security Advisor and the National Cybersecurity Coordinator is the right apex structure for the defense of our cyberspace. During my talk, I shall attempt to tackle the subject of cybersecurity from a national strategic perspective. In the process, I shall be giving out my views on the importance of treating cyberspace as a warfighting domain, as many of the earlier speakers have already touched upon, and the special role which our armed forces need to play in securing this new frontier of warfare. Now, one might ask, how does a talk centered on warfare relate to the cybersecurity concerns of the industry, which is the theme of today's seminar? Well, I would respond as follows. Firstly, the industry is deeply involved in provision of our critical infrastructure, and cyber defense of our critical infrastructure is an important segment of my talk. And secondly, and this applies to the students too, it is always good to know the cybersecurity environment in which one functions, even when you are working on cybersecurity issues, the extent to which one can expect the state to safeguard one's interests, which in turn would dictate measures which the industry would need to take to defend itself. Well, with that introduction, let me plunge into the main subject of my talk. Why is cyberspace a warfighting domain? And what is the rationale for armed forces to get involved in the defense of cyberspace? With a heavy dependence on networks in the 21st century, cyberspace is proving to be of critical importance for the projection of military force and has been formally designated by many nations in their respective military doctrines as the fifth domain of warfare. The other four domains being land, sea, air, and space. This was touched upon earlier by one of the earlier speakers. This emergence is arguably the most fundamental change in warfare in the past half century. Networks are emerging as future battlefields where cyber weapons attack and defend at electronic speeds, using strategies and tactics which are still evolving. Thus, the traditional physical battlefield is gradually metamorphosing into a battle space with physical, information, and cognitive dimensions. The US widest strategy for operating in cyberspace of 2011, as well as its doctrine for cyberspace operations of 2013, was the first to formally recognize cyberspace as a domain of warfare. India, too, in its Joint Services Doctrine of 2017, refers to cyberspace as an operational domain, And although the current military doctrines of some of the other major players, such as China and Russia, are not readily available, it is evident from the resources and capabilities being developed by them that they regard cyberspace as a warfighting domain. At this point, let me attempt to sketch the contours of a notional model of our national cyberspace for the purpose of further discussions during this talk. A formal definition of the term cyberspace apparently does not exist in any military doctrine, nor is there any globally accepted definition of this term. However, a US Department of Defense document appropriately captures the essence of cyberspace by describing it as an independent network of IT infrastructures, including the internet, telecommunication networks, and computer systems, and the content that flows across and through these components. Now, while I'm attempting to arrive at a suitable cyber governance architecture, it is important to formulate a national view on the contentious issue of cyber sovereignty. The earlier speaker just touched upon cyber sovereignty. The idea of national sovereignty is intimately tied to the sanctity of territorial integrity. I'm talking of national sovereignty now, which is intimately today tied to the sanctity of territorial integrity. In terms of the traditional physical warfighting domains of land, sea, and air, territorial boundaries are in general well demarcated. Space, that is the fourth domain, is also a physical domain, but it is a global commons as per the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, and hence the idea of national sovereignty cannot be extended to this domain. Cyberspace, in contrast to the other four domains, is a virtual domain, which lies in the information realm. Because of its nebulous nature and its perhaps inaccurate identification with the internet, which is perceived as a global commons, it may not be so easy to set up barriers around national cyberspace. Nevertheless, the Great Firewall of China is an example of attempting to do just that. We just talked, some speakers talked about privacy. The Supreme Court of India has ruled that the freedom of usage of the internet is protected under the Constitution. Such rights associated with the free flow of information in cyberspace are an important concern while attempting to draw secure boundaries around our national cyberspace. Nevertheless, given the increasing intensity of cyber attacks, General Asthana just spoke of the right to defend. So, given the increasing intensity of cyber attacks being mounted by all types of actors, many of which have strategic connotations, there is a need to have a national strategy to defend our cyberspace. In other words, the concept of cyber sovereignty and how we wish to define cyber boundaries needs to be deliberated upon and crystallized from a national security perspective. Keeping the above considerations in mind, one possible conceptualization of national cyberspace, or also called national information infrastructure, is as follows. The collection of all individual computer systems and intranets and the information residing in them, which are owned by a nation. By that I mean all Indian citizens and national entities. In this model, all networking links internal to an entity, that is not routed over the internet, are considered as part of respective intranets. Importantly, the internet is taken to be a global commons and not included within the logical expanse of national cyberspace. The collection of all these computer systems and intranets may be grouped into three components. Critical information infrastructure, called CII, defense information infrastructure, DII or defense cyberspace, and non-critical information infrastructure. Now, CII, that is a critical infrastructure, have broadly been identified by the Government of India as intranets which fall in the following six categories: government, transport, telecommunications, power and energy, banking, financial services and insurance, and strategic and public enterprises. I bring your attention to the recent cyber attack on the power and electricity grid in Bombay. So that's a critical infrastructure. Defense cyberspace would include all infrastructure Infrastructure is a term which I use here synonymously with information infrastructure and intranet, which are owned and used by the Indian Armed Forces. That's defense cyberspace. And lastly, national cyberspace, less the defense cyberspace and critical infrastructure, would classify as the non-critical infrastructure. Now, with such a conceptualization of national cyberspace, individual computer systems may be visualized as point elements and each intranet as a blob. With all these elements and blob plugged into the global cyberspace, that is the internet. In other words, in this model, national cyberspace is scattered in bits and pieces within the logical expanse of global cyberspace. Importantly, each such element or blob needs to be individually protected from attacks launched from anywhere in global cyberspace. On the other hand, if the entire wide area network and information systems within the country are modeled to be part of national cyberspace, inclusive of the internet links interconnecting them, then the gateways which connect this national cyberspace to the global internet would constitute the boundary between national and global cyberspaces and suitable protection measures put in place there. Now, such a model would correspond to the Great Firewall of China, which, as we know, is frowned upon by the liberal democratic world. So, unless I specifically state otherwise, the first model, which considers the internet as a global commons, would be presumed by me for the balance of this talk. Now, given this notional model, may sound a little complicated, but I hope the general picture is there. I shall now briefly dwell on strategic cyber threat vectors and targets, some of which have been touched upon by the previous speakers. Broadly speaking, cyber attacks may be classified under five heads, namely cyber crime, cyber activism, cyber espionage, cyber terrorism, and cyber war. Cyber espionage may be of two kinds, namely industrial cyber espionage, where the industry is interested, and strategic cyber espionage at the national level. Cyber war here refers to cyber attacks carried out by a state either through state-owned cyber capabilities such as a cyber command or sponsored through non-state actors, both with the intention of achieving strategic objectives. Out of these categories, strategic cyber espionage, state-sponsored cyber terrorism, and cyber war may be classified as strategic cyber attacks. Also, all cyber assets which make up the defense and critical info spaces are strategic cyber targets within our national cyberspace. So, what should be the strategies which would be most appropriate to defend against strategic attacks on a sovereign national cyberspace? It is often said that offense is the best form of defense. Let me therefore highlight the main elements of a cyber defense strategy based on the principles of offensive defense, sometimes also referred to as active defense. Presently, the defense cyberspace is topologically structured as a three-level hierarchy. At the highest level, the entire network is air-gapped from the global cyberspace. At the next level, there are station access networks, and at the lowest level are networks serving individual establishments. Protection measures are implemented at each level of hierarchy. This is an example of a defense in depth strategy. In contrast, for the critical infrastructures and non-critical infrastructures alike in the industry, etc., network architecture is usually structured at a single level of hierarchy and is not air-gapped. For reaping the advantages of defense in depth, at least for our critical infrastructures, there appears to be a case for implementing a multi-tiered network security architecture in conjunction with secure cloud services. Now, there is also an aspect of cyber deterrence. In defense strategies, deterrence precedes protection, resilience, and response. A robust defense and defense strategy by itself has deterrence value, which is referred to as deterrence by denial. In addition, there is a deterrence by retaliation, which is again a potent deterrence strategy, which leverages the fear of retaliation induced by the declared possession of offensive cyber capabilities. Deterrence by retaliation is quite different from offensive defense, might be sound a little confusing, but it's different from offensive defense in that the former implies a force in being. It is only a deterrence, while the latter involves the actual employment of offensive capabilities. And both need to be incorporated into an effective cyber defense strategy. I stated earlier that the Great Firewall of China, which is an example of national security taking precedence over free flow of information, is almost universally derided by the liberal democratic world. However, with the increasing intensity of cyber attacks with significant strategic effects, this view is gradually undergoing a change, with the notion of cyber sovereignty gaining ground over the current predominant view that cyberspace should remain a global commons. Thus, there is a need to consider setting up of a suitable architecture for firewalling our entire national cyberspace, sometimes referred to as an internet kill switch, to be activated in terms of national emergencies. With this, now let us have a look at organizational aspects by first reviewing the existing governance setup in India. Presently, the following establishments are tasked with the defense of our national cyberspace. I already mentioned the National Critical Information Infrastructure Protection Center. It functions directly under the PMO and is designated as the National Nodal Agency for Critical Infrastructure Protection, Information Infrastructure Protection. Its charter includes identification of critical infrastructure, development of protection strategies, and issuance of cyber advisories. However, it does not have accountability, and its charter states that the responsibility for protecting the critical infrastructure lies with the agency running the critical infrastructure. So, for that means that if industry is running, let's say, electrical grid, the responsibility for running for protection is lies that with the industry and not with the NCIPC. The Indian Computer Emergency Response Team, the CERTIN, under METI, issues advisories and response to cyber incidents. Here again, its charter shies away from accountability. Broadly speaking, CERTIN caters for the non-critical infrastructure, while the NCIPC focuses on the CIM. Just very broadly. The Defense Cyber Agency, the DCA, has recently been established for providing cyber operation support to the Indian Armed Forces. It is a whittled down version of the Cyber Command, establishment of which was proposed as early as 2012. Then there is a Cyber and Information Security Division of the MHA, Ministry of Home Affairs, which deals with matters relating to cyber security and cyber crime from an internal security perspective. At the ATEX level, the National Security Council Secretariat, headed by the National Security Advisor, is the apex body responsible for national security, and under it, the National Cyber Security Coordinator coordinates with different agencies at the national level for cyber security matters. Now, currently, our strategy for the protection of national cyberspace can briefly be summarized as follows. Our existing cyberspace governance architecture appears to be premised on cyberspace being a global commons and not on the notion of cyber sovereignty. We do not yet have a national cybersecurity strategy, and while one is expected shortly, it may not adopt the philosophy of deterrence through retaliation. This reflects our essentially passive defensive approach towards protection of our national cyberspace. This mindset is also manifest in the fact that we possess limited offensive cyber capabilities. That's my view. And in my view, we need to reorient our strategy and enhance our offensive cyber capabilities for engaging in cyberspace context at the strategic level. Now, before attempting to recommend a suitable governance model, let us review the stance adopted by some of the major global players towards protection of their respective national information infrastructures. Firstly, the United States. The cyber governance architecture adopted by the United States strikes a synergetic balance between the US Cyber Command, which came up in 2010, the National Security Agency, and the recently established Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency under its Department of Homeland Security. The US Cyber Command is tasked with tackling external strategic threats in cyberspace, while the Department of Homeland Security focuses on cyber threats from the perspective of internal security. It is worth noting, though, that 13 cyber mission teams of the US Cyber Command are meant specifically for the protection of critical infrastructure. Further, the authority for the conduct of offensive operations in cyberspace appears to be vested solely with the Department of Defense. United Kingdom. The UK established the National Cybersecurity Centre, the NCSC, in 2016 under the Government Communication Headquarters, also referred to as GCHQ, which is an intelligence agency which provides signal intelligence support to the government as well as the armed forces. The NCSC subsumed the functions of UK's erstwhile Centre for Protection of National Infrastructure, something like a NCIPC, as well as CERT UK. So both of these were subsumed by the NCSC when this was raised. The British Army launched a new cyber force in 2020, namely the 6th Division, which is the largest of UK's 3 divisions and is organized to focus on cyber, electronic warfare, intelligence, information operations, and unconventional warfare. It is clear from UK's National Cybersecurity Strategy of 2016-21 that active defense is central to protection of their national cyberspace. Offensive defense, active defense, central to protection of their national cyberspace. The NCSC focuses on cybercrime, but for providing cyber operation support at the strategic level, a new national cyber force was established in November 2020, very recently, as a partnership between the armed forces and the GCHQ, with its primary charter being offensive cyber warfare directed against external threats in cyberspace, something like the US Cyber Command. China. China, our primary adversary, is now very well structured to defend its national infrastructure. The recent raising of the PLA Strategic Support Force signifies the operationalizing of its well-developed concept of integrated network electronic warfare, which includes cyber warfare, as well as the 3 warfares concept, which is psychological operations, etc. This transformative reorganization has resulted in integration of not only cyber attack and exploit capabilities, but also of cyber, electronic, and psychological warfare capabilities under the PLA, thus considerably enhancing China's capabilities as a dominant power in cyberspace. Russia. All the details of the cyber governance architecture of Russia are not readily available in the open domain. The strategic nature of its preparedness in cyberspace may be gauged by its infamous information warfare campaigns conducted by it across the globe in recent years, which have served as a wake-up call for the United States, the European Union, and even China. It has also been established beyond doubt that the GRU, the main intelligence directorate of the Russian military, was behind the cyber attack on Ukraine's electricity grid in 2015, the devastating 2017 NotPetya cyber attack, which affected businesses across the globe, the interference in US presidential elections in 2016, and the hacking of the French election in 2017, amongst others. So Russia has been most proactive in carrying out state-level cyber attacks. Finally, I would like to now present my views on the transformative restructuring which India needs to undertake for addressing strategic threats in cyberspace. The governance model which I am proposing here envisages a central role for armed forces and cyberspace defense, much in line with their role in the physical domains of conflict. This involves bringing about a significant change in our doctrinal thought as well as operational capabilities in cyberspace. At the doctrinal level, our national cyberspace needs to be recognized to be as important a sovereign asset, albeit virtual, as our physical territorial assets. Further, the mandate for handling the full spectrum of strategic cyber conflicts must rest with the armed forces. Major Astana brought out cyberspace. One of its attributes is it can be carried out across the spectrum of conflict and is being carried out on a daily basis. So, the mandate for handling the full spectrum of strategic cyber conflicts must rest with the armed forces. Such a charter would cover state-on-state cyber attacks separately or as part of multi-domain operations, as also strategic cyber terrorism and strategic cyber espionage. Most importantly, development and operationalizing offensive cyber capabilities at the strategic level must be the exclusive domain of the armed forces. And for armed forces to take on this responsibility, it is imperative that the recently created Defense Cyber Agency be upgraded to a full-fledged cyber command at the earliest, with commensurate transformative changes in HRD and cadre management policies. Also, cyber expertise within the DRDO must be placed at the disposal of the Cyber Command for developing suitable cyber weapons and technologies. What is the role of the other government agencies? Well, with the armed forces under the MOD, if they are given a pivotal role for defense of the national cyberspace, what would be the charter of these agencies? The proposed restructuring envisages an enhanced role for the Ministry of Home Affairs, while at the same time limiting the charter of intelligence agencies. Protection of CII, being an internal security matter, must logically be brought under the aegis of the Ministry of Home Affairs in the following manner. I am proposing that just like the CISF under the MHA provides physical security to critical infrastructure, a new para-cyber force should be raised for providing cyber protection to the critical infrastructure. For government and public sector critical infrastructure, that is railways, nuclear installations, defense PSUs, etc., the para-cyber force would be mandated to provide all echelons of cyber protection. However, in the case of critical infrastructures owned by the private sector, that is private power generation, banks and financial institutions, etc., the para-cyber force would work in close conjunction with the chief information security officers of the private enterprises for provision of additional tiers of security firewalls, as also to carry out external audit by adopting measures such as ethical hacking and red team. A national cyber security security operation center or cyber SOC needs to be established under the Ministry of Home Affairs, manned by the para cyber force, which would subsume the responsibilities of the current NCIPC as well as certain. The alerts and advisories issued by this center would benefit the non-critical infrastructure, including individual citizens. While incident reporting and response by this center would mostly be restricted to the critical infrastructure, in case of major incidents, this support could be extended to the non-critical infrastructure as well. Most importantly, if at any stage the imminent threat to one or more of our critical infrastructures attains strategic dimensions, the task of CIA protection would be handed over to the armed forces. This could be done, for example, by placing the National Cyber SOC under the Cyber Command. Cybercrime would continue to be handled by the Ministry of Home Affairs as is being done even now. What about intelligence agencies? Intelligence agencies such as RAW and NTRO would continue to carry out cyber espionage and counter-espionage in conformance with their traditional mandate. Now there may also be a need. We talked about the now non-attributable part, and this is exploited at nation-state levels. There may be a need to enlist the services of existing hacker groups in order to leverage the advantage of plausible deniability where needed, as in all probability is being done even now, or even facilitate the creation of cyber militias with state backing. Now this, however, would be part of covert operations to be conducted by agencies as permissible under existing provisions. What about human resource development? It is pertinent to highlight here that the armed forces are well geared to take on the enhanced role proposed for them. By that I mean they can quickly upscale to carry out this role. I have commanded the Military College of Telecommunication Engineering, and this is what we do there. So they can be quickly upgraded to nurture much higher levels of specialization, to upscale, provided a cyber command is raised, and the HRD policies are upgraded to nurture much higher levels of specialization than existing today. The same, however, cannot be stated for the Ministry of Home Affairs, where much greater effort would need to be mustered if it is to play its enhanced role in cyberspace. Well, with that I come to conclude by saying that in 21st century conflict scenarios, cyberspace has emerged as a formidable new domain of warfare only over the last decade or so. Given that the threats from our adversaries in cyberspace are already manifest and will rapidly intensify in the coming years, it is imperative, as opposed to an incremental approach, the recommended transformative changes to our cyber governance architecture be undertaken as a national priority and on a war footing. Thank you very much. I hope you find these inputs useful.